thrilled to be partnering with Sam here on this series of speakers. I think it's a great opportunity for us to learn much about our communities and areas we didn't know before. And I think it's just delightful that these people spend their time and energy. Thank you, Jack, for doing this. Thank you very much. And it's just really a delight to partner with this cute young lady over here to get these things rolling. So welcome to the center. I hope you enjoy this presentation this evening. I'm sure we all will. And so I'm going to turn it over to Miss Sam here.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending the third speaker event in Blaine County Museum's 2023 Off-Season Speaker Series. I'm Samantha French, Director of Blaine County Museum, and I'll be introducing tonight's speaker, Jack Mattingly. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few program and museum updates. We'll try not to talk forever. Our next speaker is Rod Benson on Wednesday, February 7th at 5:30 p.m. He's a science teacher at Hayes Lodgepole High School, and he'll be giving us a Reader's Digest version of Blaine County area geology. Notice we have changed the time of Rod's presentation from 7 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. We'll be hosting our final speaker, Carl Davis, at the Montana Seed Show in Harlem on Friday, March 8th, so stay tuned for more about that. We're very excited. The museum has updated its winter hours as well. We are now open from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Your donations help us sustain this program for future seasons, so if you enjoyed tonight's event, please donate what we can. I'd also like to thank our wonderful hosts, Ginger Hansen and the Chinook Senior Center, who have graciously allowed us to use their venue for our speaker program this year. The museum is beyond grateful for this partnership, without which this program would not be possible. Remember to thank Ginger for providing the evening's food and beverages. She really has gone above and beyond to make these events exceptional. I'm sure many of you know tonight's speaker well, and you might already know a little about the history of the local Methodist Church and its ties to legendary Montana circuit rider, Brother William Wesley Van Orsdel. But I'd be surprised if anybody leaves tonight without some new information about our community and its place in the sweeping history of our state. This summer, after talking a little about the Brother Van House Museum in Great Falls, Jack mentioned to me he presented about Brother Van and the Chinook Methodist Church in Great Falls about a decade ago. When it came to planning the speaker series this year, Jack was one of the first people I thought to invite. I'm so excited to learn more about this topic, and I know I'm not the only one. Jack Mattingly is a Montana native who grew up in Dillon and Great Falls. He has BA degrees in Russian, French, and special education from the University of Montana and an MS in elementary education from Northern Montana College. Jack taught in Chinook for 34 years. He attended the Claremont School of Theology, and today he serves on the UMC Board of Ordained Ministry. He is also site coordinator for the Presbyterian Church's Young Adult Volunteer site in Chinook. Please welcome Jack Mattingly.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's nice to see all of you here. Some of you I haven't seen for a while, and others seems like I saw you just a couple days ago. But it's a joy to be able to share with you, and hopefully I won't chase you off too fast. Brother William Wesley Van Orsdel, right there I got the real basic facts on him. He was 71 when he passed away in 1919. He was born just outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As a teenager, he actually witnessed the Battle of Gettysburg, and that formed a lot of his opinions about life in general. And some authors even speculate that was when he first decided to become a preacher, was in watching the battle and saying, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so he eventually comes out to Montana in 1872. He came out on the steamboat, the Far West, and got off the steamboat in Fort Benton, Montana, and that began his career as a Montana Methodist circuit rider, meaning for the first 20 years or so, he was just traveling all over the state, doing things. He did a lot of amazing things. A before and after picture, basically. 40 years difference between these two pictures here in his early 20s, and this other photo that's you see in a lot of Methodist churches in Montana, was taken about a year before his death. So he was a youngster when he came out in his early 20s, and he served and was still serving at the church in one way or another at the time of his death. If you've been to the Russell Museum and Gallery in Great Falls, you may have seen this painting down there Russell did of him up on the Blackfeet Reservation. The Blackfeet took him out and let him hunt buffalo, and this is supposed, from what his accounts of it and the Blackfeet accounts, what happened there. And the Blackfeet he had a special relationship with, and that was continued over the years, and he gave the Methodist Church in Montana sort of a challenge to help take care of the reservation, and so the church actually owns a section of land just outside of Browning, besides this church site there in Browning. And so over the last few years, actually, the pastor that was up there had a thing for horses, and they did a lot of work with horses and developing that land where it had not been used for many years. But when he first came out, it was Sunday, July 1st, and he got off the steamboat in Fort Benton, Montana. And for most of his career, he was in southwest Montana in the gold fields. But his plan of action started the same in Fort Benton as it was for years. He came into Fort Benton, walked around town. They'd had a thunderstorm, so he found out what good Montana gumbo is like. And he went to one of the saloons and went in and said, "Hey, could you shut it down for an hour tonight and have a church service?" And the proprietor thought it sounded like a good idea, might get some more bodies in or something like that. And so that's what he did. And his way he did it was he sang and preached. He loved to sing. He was not known for being the greatest of singers, but he had a heart for singing. So Diamonds in the Rough was one of his favorites that he sang. He did not sing the Brother Van song that you'll hear later. That was sort of given to him as after his death. Where he comes to our area is in the latter years. By the late 1880s, early 1890s, he was named administrator of the Northern Montana Missions. We were sort of the mission area of the state at that time because that was when the Great Northern came through with the railroad and some of that type of thing. But what was his accomplishments? Pretty amazing when you look at it. Over 100 churches in the state of Montana have their foundation with him as being one of the people that made it happen. 50 parsonages, housing for the pastors, getting that done. Then probably the next couple I think are the most important to us as a heritage in Montana. The hospitals, the deaconess hospitals around the state of Montana, including Billings, which is now the Billings Clinic. Great Falls, Benefice is still there. Bozeman is still the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital. And in Havre, the Deaconess Hospital in Havre that was eventually combined into Northern Montana Hospital as well. So those are just amazing things. There's 6 hospitals in the state of Montana that had a direct connection to Brother Van. Rocky Mountain College, which was in Helena until 1935 in the earthquake. And at that time, they moved to Billings and combined with the college there that the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians were doing there. So now Rocky Mountain is a Methodist, Episcopal, and Presbyterian institution. Intermountain Home in Helena was the Deaconess Home for Children. And it's renowned around the world for its treatment programs for children who are having behavioral and emotional issues. So those, I think, are some of the most important long-term things that happened with Brother Van that really carry through into our day and age today. So his legacy is still here in so many ways. Chinook was special to him, and we'll go into that as we go through this. He spent probably more time in Chinook in his latter years than any other place, and I'll explain why. He was stricken with the stroke that eventually killed him here in Chinook. And so he was prophetic in some ways because he had his Christmas cards printed up every year, and this is the message he put on his Christmas card that year. My first Christmas in heaven. If you think back to that passing date on the first slide, he passed away in December, prior to Christmas. And so the cards were sent out around the time of his death. He is buried in Helena, in this big cemetery there in Helena. And if you go to the cemetery, they can direct you to where he is. Evidently, it's one of the graves that a lot of people do go to see. So, you know, there's information out there on Brother Van. If you notice, these are the two main books out there. They're written by the same man, Bob Lind. The Brother Van, Montana Pioneer Preacher is the updated version. It looks like this. You can find it on Amazon, or if you call down to Great Falls to the Brother Van Experience, they have all the available copies that Bob Lind's wife, Carol Dover Lind, had. And if you're looking for the old version, it looked like this, which is from the ground up. Bob Lind, we'll see later, has a Chinook connection as well. So Chinook is all over Brother Van and the stuff with him. And I talked to his son, Bob Lind Jr., the other day, and he said that as far as he knew, all the books that his mother had, she had several cases of them, and they are in Great Falls. And I think it's under $30 for a copy. The Brother Van house is located just outside First Methodist Church in Great Falls, and the reason I have this here is it shows you a little bit of what the lifestyle of this man was. It gives you a clue to who he was. This is the dresser in the room they had set aside for him in the years he stayed in Great Falls. He had his main office in Great Falls, and the hat is one of his hats. The top coat is the top coat that he typically wore. And you see he had a lot of books. He lived a pretty Spartan lifestyle. Here's the other furnishings in that room. Some of them are not the actual furnishings. They had because over the years the real ones disappeared, so they just went from some photographs they had. Here's what he lived out of all his life in Montana. There's a steamer trunk at the foot, and then his overnight bag that he would tie onto his saddle when he was traveling by horse. And so pretty amazing when you think about all these years, particularly when he was probably considered the most eligible bachelor for most of his career in the state, too. They have an organ there. It came up on the steamboat. And what's interesting is to operate it, instead of using your feet for the pedals down to play music, you got to pump it. So anyway, so we'll get back to Brother Van a lot as we go on further here, as we get into the Chinook Methodist Church. 10 years ago, this is what it looked like out front. Pretty much unchanged in 100 and some years. And the Methodist Church has always had this location. It was at one time the highest point in town. And I guess that was what the founding fathers were looking for at that time. But in 1889, that was when Methodists first started meeting informally in people's homes here in Chinook. And they had one of the pastors in Great Falls, Jacob Mills, coming up here and helping them a little bit. And but they were just in folks' homes. Now, on July 2nd, 1889, William A. Spencer came to Chinook. He had been in Helena for some church meetings, our annual conference, and he was on the train heading back to his office in Philadelphia. He was in charge of what we now called the General Board of Discipleship. And the train had to stop here in Chinook to get fuel and water. Takes about an hour, I guess, and so he had contacted somebody in Chinook, and so they met over at City Hall, and they had the first official worship here in Chinook run by the Methodist Church. About the same time, in late 1889, 1890, Brother Van was first appointed as the supervisor or district superintendent for the Great Falls district and area. And his district ran from Great Falls to Glasgow. And in those days, the fastest way to get any place was either a car. But still, most of the folks were doing horseback. So things continue on in this time. In Chinook, in 1891, the pastor that was sort of serving here by the name of Armstrong started going down to Harlem as well. And he started going over to Havre and then down to Glasgow and having services in all three towns at one time or another. And then Harlem and Chinook and Havre were sort of mixed in together. By that time, we're starting to see some things with Brother Van showing up in Chinook. October of 1890, he preaches for the first time in Chinook. And then this is where his involvement really gets involved. He helps the church organize. By March of the following year, the church is formally organized. 11 members were received into membership by him at that time, and the congregation is officially formed. It's about that time they start talking about, we need to have a building. And so they start thinking about, what do we do then? Raising money. And in a course of about a year, they come up with a budget. $1,800 budget for construction. And I believe that was a pretty good sum. Well, they gave the construction contract to Peter Denny. Some of the folks that were around here for a long time might remember Peter's daughter, Margaret Aker. And so that was a connection to modern church. Well, he did all the construction work with aid of local folks. And so in just a couple years from the time they started, they were able to do the official cornerstone in 1893. And then just a little less than a year later, they have the first worship in the sanctuary. And the sanctuary and the original building is just the main part of the building. It didn't include that part that goes off to the north. That was the original building. It was a solid wall there at that time. And Brother Van came up and preached. Now, in those early days in Montana, Brother Van was probably more important and a bigger figure to the folks who were Methodists than the bishop. Nowadays, the really good thing is if you could get Bishop Olavito to come up here and preach. But in those days, if you wanted anything special, you had Brother Van come up and do it. And so they have the church dedicated in 1896. And the way that things are going in those days, the pastor is serving, he's all over Blaine County. He starts doing services in 96 in Belknap and Harlem. And in 97, things shift a little bit as the population moves around. He's doing stuff out at Paradise Valley School, Chinook, Upper Clear Creek, Lloyd. 98, he's going to some folks by the name of Flinders, having a service in their home. Out at a place out Hungry Hollow, Maddox, it's spelled with a UX at the end, Lloyd, and Cleveland. Well, in 1899, a sad day, I'm quoting Mrs. West in her book about this. She says a sad day was had in 1899 because the Presbyterians that were members of the congregation left because they founded their own congregation just down the street. You can see out the back window of the church, the two churches in those days. And so they start the Presbyterians. And so things are going along pretty good. Here's a few of the things that are around. They're still around. This is the original altar that Peter Denny made. One of the interesting things about it is where you see it says God is love. That is, he made that by pounding nails in all over the place to set off the letters. It's pretty amazing. You can see it, it's over in Wallner Hall now, and anytime we've had services in Wallner Hall over the years, we move it out and use it. So it's 100 and some years old. It's the other thing that's old, and we don't bring it out much anymore, is this the original Bible that was given to the congregation in the 1890s. And it wasn't brand new then, because when I opened up the cover looking at it, it says that where they have the presentation stuff, and sadly nobody filled it out, but it says, like 18 whatever, it has 18.8 dash. So it was printed up in the 1880s. It was used until about 94, 95 of this last year. So it was in use about 100 years. It's a leather cover with cut indentations and stuff. It's pretty amazing. Those old Bibles like that in books with the leather covers. And the next item I got here, if you've ever were a child in Chinook and went to anything at the Methodist Church, this is what you remember. Yeah. The little church. Peter Denny was among the people that made it. The shingles on the roof are made by cuts of real shingles. Up at the top where you see the little American flag shield is a slot. You could drop your coin in there and it would go down, hit a bell, and it would ring. And it goes down. Where the front steps are is a drawer that pulls out. Now, how many of you that ever did that did this? You went up, put your coin in, pulled the drawer out, got your coin out, and rang it again. My grandkids, that was one of the things they always looked forward to when they came up as little kids, is take us up to the church so we can ring the bell. And it was that bell they were talking about. So, and I've had people come and say, they painted it the wrong colors when they repainted it. I was told it was supposed to be red trim around the windows or something like that. So people are real picky about things. The 1900s style, what they called the bear paw charge. And that changes a lot off and on over the years. But one of the interesting things I found in there, that there was an editorial in the Chinook paper in 1900, in the fall of 1900, urging all the churches in town to fence their buildings off, because in the wintertime the cattle that roamed around the town would get up by the churches to get out of the wind and would make a mess. Well, the comment was none of the churches followed through on that. But it's sort of interesting that. In 1900 was also when the congregation here helped the folks out at the Maddox location build a log church out there. And if you go out on Hungry Hollow Road now, you can see an iron sculpture depiction of the old Maddox Church out there still. I believe it's on some of the Young Crowley property out there. It's a couple miles, probably about 5 miles east of the Clear Creek Road where it's located out there. And that was a huge church for many years in Blaine County as far as Methodism. But the Bear Paw Charge also included Ada and Lloyd for many years. And so the pastor here was kept busy. And for many years, there was 6 services around the area in various locations in people's homes. The addition to the church was first proposed in 1901. Budget of $925 for that addition that goes off to the north. And that was where the Sunday school was held for many years. And below it, when they did the basement, that was where all the dinners used to be. So you can imagine that if you went to the Swiss steak dinner here a week or so ago, having that dinner down in the basement of the church. Probably a little bit more crowded. 1903, something really important happened. They got new pews. The oak pews there, that's when they were purchased. We always assume that when churches start, they always have everything there. But no, they had the fundraise for those too. So they got those pews. Those are the ones that have a little bit of a jog in the middle of them. The ones that are solid and round, we'll talk about in 1968 when they come into play. 1906, here's what the pastor was doing. He was going to Lloyd, Cleveland, Maddox, Clear Creek, and occasionally Warwick and Rydell, besides Chinook. So they were pretty busy, and all horseback. The pastors here did not have a car until it was in the 1920s, as far as I could find. So, and of course, a lot of those old Model Ts and stuff didn't go very fast anyway. So, can you imagine doing some of that stuff even today? So this is what we were looking at in the early 1900s as far as the church. Notice it's up on a little hill. So a few changes there. Mrs. West noted that the streets of Chinook over the years were gradually graded down, all of them, there was a house on Main Street that they used as they had a bolt on something there that they did all the streets in relationship to, because a lot of adjustment to the city. Here's an interesting photo. If you know any of these ladies, let me know. Nobody knows. And one of the more interesting things about this photo is on the upper right and in the second row on the far left, photoshopping 1905.
You're right.
Both those ladies were added in at a later date. And the only notation on the photo is Ladies' Aid 1905. And so, sort of interesting. Also, about 1905, the metal tin ceiling, as it's called, was put in. And one of the more interesting stories about this, I'll point this out. There's that glob. There's a glob on the ceiling. And everybody for years assumed it was a plug that maybe they were going to hang something and decided not to. So Morris Harshman told me he assumed it was an early attempt at wiring electrically, and somebody decided, no, we're not going to do that. And it was at the first all-class reunion. Sandy Reynolds was pastor. Her husband, Ron, went over to see how things were going because they just opened up the building, let people come in. And there were two older women sitting in there in the pews, pointing up, laughing, and just giggling. And he asked them what they were laughing about, and they said that. And it turned out they'd had a Methodist Youth Fellowship, MYF meeting there, and when the pastor wasn't looking, they'd made a big, gigantic spitball out of a paper towel and threw it up, and it stuck. And over the years, the various painters had painted over it. Well, I had no idea who the women were. And in 2010, when I showed this, Spike Bruss saw that and raised his hand and said, I know who they were. One of them was his older sister. He didn't say who the other one was. So a Bruss family connection there. So 19 teens, epic era in the United States. Well, the Women's Christian Temperance Union came to town. The women in the church invited Carrie Nation to come and speak. And so you can imagine that made a bit of a ruckus around the area. In back of the church, I guess there used to be a little hill. They graded that off. And so they're doing all sorts of things. But Brother Van in the teens really is in Chinook a lot. One of the years they noted was the 13-14 church year. He was here 25 plus times. And they said that was pretty much the norm for most of those years. Now, district superintendents, even today, if you see them once a year in person, that's pretty good. But to be here 25 times is pretty amazing. Part of the reason was Chinook was about halfway on all the area he served. The other thing is he established an office here in Chinook at the Regal home. And their daughter, Leafy, was his secretary here. And evidently, when he actually had a stroke, he was dictating something to Leafy. And he made a statement to her, "I can't get my left arm in my jacket." And she went over to see what was wrong, and that's when he fell to the ground. And the doctors that came over said he'd had a stroke. He stayed there until they thought he was well enough to travel, and that's when they moved him to Great Falls. But in the few weeks he was here, the Junior League women of Chinook serenaded him regularly outside his bedroom window, which over at the Regal home, that they sang his favorite hymns and songs to him, and he was special to Chinook. You know, he because of all the time he was here. It was not unusual to have, even though there were pastors here this whole time, that people would save up their baptisms until he came. In the early years of the church, you look over the records of baptisms, and the presiding elder or pastor was almost W.W. Van Orsdel. And so it was a special privilege to do that, and he did an amazing number of those over the years. And being the world's most eligible bachelor, as far as many people were concerned, that also didn't hurt. Early in his years in Montana, he had been engaged to a young woman by the name of Jenny Johnston. And she was off to college and was died while she was in college. And he never had another serious relationship after that, though there were people that thought he had a little bit of a shine to Leafy Regal, but nothing ever came of that. But she was his secretary for all those years. Frank Sharples assured me that this is the Regal home. And you may know it as the McKinsey House. And it makes sense when you read some of the stories about how his office was on the second floor and all that sort of stuff, and where he could hear and watch the trains from his office. So it's fitting for the Regals owned a sawmill out at Landusky and sold that when they moved to Chinook, and were well-to-do members of the church. In the 20s and 30s, we see some amazing growth in the church. And this, I should also note too, this, even though it's a history of the Chinook Methodist Church, it's actually sort of the history of the other churches in town, because as the Methodists are doing this, some of the other churches are having similar numbers and things happening. You know, in 1925, the pastor was doing Fairview out south of town here, Zurich, and a family's home by the name of Smotherman. And I don't know where that would be. But interestingly enough, in May of that year, they noted that out at the New Hope School, they were having a Sunday school, church school, and they had 30 kids out there. There's not 30 people out at New Hope area now, but there were 30 kids out there. In Chinook, church school, Sunday school on Sundays was running 112 kids. It shows a little bit of how different the population was. It was a much younger population those days, but also reflects agriculture and how we did agriculture in those days, not as much mechanized things. Now, 1927, Sunday school got even bigger in Chinook. It was up to 150 kids. 150 kids. And at the same time, the Presbyterians were doing their thing and the Catholics were doing theirs. So, and the Lutherans also had theirs. So we had 4 congregations running Sunday school and 150 at the church. One of the big things in those days, in the late 20s, is they took the dirt off the sides of the church to where it has its present look. The outside walls of the basement were exposed in that time. And it took them a few years because it was 1929 by the time they finished that. And they removed the cornerstone from where it was and placed it another spot in the wall. And that I have not discovered where it was moved to. But it was noted that when they opened it up just to see what was in it, water had gotten in it. So it's quite possible now you open it up. The only thing might be the coins that were put in there. The other thing people always remark about churches, older churches, is when they come in, is the stained glass windows. Prior to the 30s, there were not stained glass windows in there. And what they did was, you think back to some of your grade schools, you made stained glass art things where you just took tissue paper and glued them to black paper and you cut out designs. That's actually what they did on the stained glass window, or where the stained glass windows are in the church. But all these years they've been fundraising for windows, and finally in 1937 they got the windows that are in there. They didn't install them right, did they, Barb? Barb was the person that restored them in the 1980s, and we discovered they had misinstalled the windows, and thankfully Barb discovered how they should be, and we got them up so they didn't fall apart. But here's some of the windows, and they were all dedicated by families to some of the early folks in the church. Most of these are on the south side, of course, with the good light. Now, the one on the left is actually new. That's the one that the Wallner family, Paul Wallner, Ernestine Olson, and Ed Wallner, dedicated and had built for their mother, Gwen Wallner. The artisan that came up said, you can see, said some of the colors are no longer available in stained glass. And so that's why he matched the design, but not the colors. And so, the new one ran about $6,000, so you can figure out how expensive it was and why it took them so many years to pay for the others. Well, in the 1940s, World War II dominated things in Chinook during that period of time. As Mrs. West writes a lot about, seeing the boys off to various places and other people going to work in factories and that type of things. So the whole World War II scene was pretty active here in Chinook as well. And it isn't until after World War II we start seeing things happen. And the big thing that happens there is my generation, the baby boomers, start happening. And things really take off in a lot of ways for the church. In the 1950s, we start doing fundraising for Wallner Hall. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. 1960s, Wallner Hall becomes a real dominant part of the church. And then some changes start happening with the sanctuary. Here gives you an idea of some things. Now these are not baby boomers, because this is the junior high age church vacation school in 1946. One of the people in there is Bev Stam. I don't know which one is Bev. Bev is the one that gave us this photo. Now the next photo, Ed Dover was the pastor from 1947 to 1959, and he did a lot of baptisms during that time. This one's So in honor of that, in 1954, they had what was called Cradle Roll Call Sunday. And in there are some folks that some of you might know. Kathy Harbolt. That's her mom, Arlene. Frankie and Johnny Overcast. And that's Dow and Margaret Holdium. Danny Harshman. Morris hates it. I always hate it when people point this out. Morris Harshman with hair. Lori Doughton Rigg. Pauline and RB. Mitzi Bruss and Jenny. And Spike and Doug Bruss. There's some of the ones that were still around our area in recent years. So, and down in the front, the older girl is one of the DePriest girls. I don't remember if it's Moselle or not, but so Moselle, okay. So it, shows a little bit of the baby boom in action. All the little kids in there are under 2 years. And Ed Dover was busy with the water in those years because, he had just a few baptisms. 1954-55, which includes this, he had 66 baptisms. Can you imagine? I say in the 50s is when they started saying, we've outgrown our educational and dinner capabilities with the church, and so we have to do something. So Ernie Wallner was appointed chair of the building committee for the social hall. And they set up and planned a budget, $40,000 and started raising it. And by 1958, they had got the $40,000 and they started construction on Wallner Hall. And that's Ernie Wallner. Not a very tall man, but he worked down there. He was helping put together the walls. That's in the basement of Wallner Hall before they poured the floors and made the cutouts for the windows and stuff like that. At that time, it was not Wallner Hall. The name came about because Ernie suffered a stroke after church one Sunday. Basically, he walked across the church to over by where Don Ranstrom's law office used to be, and he was going down to his car and had a stroke. And he had been the Sunday school superintendent at that time since the late 1930s. Can you imagine doing that, being Sunday school superintendent with a bunch of little kids without some of the other controls? No. So they did decide to dedicate it to Ernie Wallner. And in 1961, Bishop Phillips came up for it, and then Ed Dover came back as well for it. Prior to my serving 20 years, Ed Dover had the longest tenure here in Chinook. One of the interesting things about the 1950s and Ed Dover, his daughter Carol got married just prior to moving back to Chinook. She married a guy that was teaching at Chinook High School by the name of Bob Lind. And they had a son who years later I met, and he was baptized in 1952 in the church. I met Bob Lind down in California. I was a greeter one year when I was going to school down there, and I saw this guy coming up. We had food for everybody on the first day, and he's coming up for it, and I told him who I was and and where I was at, and he said, "Oh, I've been in your church." "Oh, Chinook, Montana, you've been in my church, and you're from Phoenix?" And he says, "Yeah, I was baptized there by my grandfather, Ed Dover." And it was interesting that I'd seen his dad just a couple of weeks prior to that at annual conference. So Bob Lind had a connection to this church. Bob was, I don't know what he taught at Chinook High School, but he did eventually go into the ministry. By 1952, he was studying, and he served in a number of churches around this area. And the book, Brother Van, was one of his works that he did in the late 50s as well. By the 1960s, some changes happened over at the church. One of them is there used to be accordion-like doors in the church over there, and they were taken out, and so now it's just that big doorway. If any of you know what happened to those doors, we would like to know where it went, just out of curiosity. Nobody remembers what happened. Also in 1968, because that north section didn't have any pews, they decided to do something. Remember I mentioned about 1903 and the Methodist pews? Well, in 1906, the Presbyterians got some pews. And in the mid-60s, they did some remodeling. And they bought the pews they have currently. They were looking for a home for their old ones. The Methodist Church bought their old. So in some photos I'll show you here, you'll see the long curved are the old Presbyterian pews. Warren Ross told me he always enjoyed coming to things at the Methodist Church because he could look and see where he used to sit all those years. So that was the biggest change. And then, of course, moving across the little driveway there to Wallner Hall for Sunday school and all the dinners. And Wallner Hall has become more of a sort of a community center and over the years as well. 1971, the Chinook United Methodist Church was designated United Methodist Historic Site number 10. Some of that was because it was the oldest Brother Van church that had been used continually for all those years. If you go up in the church, in the attic and stuff, there's no big boards. It's all 1 and 2 by 12 boards up there and stuff they're making. And it's amazingly constructed up there. And there was a remodeling done on it. And we'll mention a couple of things with that. Probably the long-term ministry of the church, I think, that came about in the 1970s that was impacted the most is the 1977, a couple of young women here in town decided there needed to be a daycare, a professional daycare. And they began working on it, and Kids Corner opened up in the basement. And the church has basically donated the space down there to them all these years. So Kids Corner started in 1977. I think Wanda has actually been involved with it all those years too. Not as director all those years, but she started working there in 77. So 1988. By 1988, we had a lot of issues with the building. There was some dry rot starting to happen on some of the siding and some of those types of things. Pearl Reeves passed away, and her will was all my estate goes to the Methodist Church trustees for the upkeep and taking care of the church. And so we did a massive remodeling at that time, a restoration more than anything. On the outside, with new siding to replace the old. There were some folks that didn't like that because it's not exactly the same siding. But when they started taking the old stuff off, like I say, there was a lot of dry rot underneath. And you'll see in the next slide, and I'll go back. In the tower, the old slide you might know, remember, had a circular window above the door. For whatever reason, that was covered up. If you go up in the steeple, you can still see the circular window frame and stuff, but it was covered up. That was the other controversial thing with Mrs. West and a few others. That was at the time Barb Ranstrom got involved with the restoration of windows. I think it started out, you were just going to clean them.
Right.
It was she was just going to clean them, and in the process of cleaning them, discovered there's little rods that were supposed to be put into the frame to hold the weight of the window up, and they hadn't been installed. And so
Starting to bow.
some of the windows were actually bowing quite a bit, and a couple of them, there was a pretty good gap at the top too. So Barb figured out how to get those things put back together and cleaned. And one of the
I am John Holm.
and John Holm, yeah, Gunther. And one of the things we discovered is they never cleaned the windows when they came from the people originally. There was some of the coating that they used to protect them still on some of the windows and stuff. So the plaster inside was restored and the whole inside was repainted. 1994, we were in the restoration mood. We remodeled the basement of Walner Hall. So in 2010, this is how the building looked. And of course, there's the relationship. Here's the biggest change that happened out front, is the Good Shepherd statue. It was donated by Jolynn Anderson in memory of her mother, Betty Sprinkle, and her grandmother, Maida McCartney. And I'll have to admit that for a couple of years, if I came out of the church at night, if I wasn't telling myself it's there, you come out and here's this tall figure there in the shadows, it would cause your heart to jump a beat or two. And this is after the restoration inside the church. There has been one change. That green in the back is now a darker green. Lita Campbell did the green here, and then she decided, no, it needed to be darker. And once when she was home visiting here a few years ago, it became the darker green. And you can see some of the original pews here in the picture. The banners, let's see some of those a little bit more detail. Sort of looking from the front to the back. There's the north side with the Presbyterian pews. Warren Ross claimed to me he could see which pew was his. And knowing Warren, he probably was right. In the restoration, one of the other things we did was they re-angled the pews so that you were actually looking at the pastor. Before they did that, you were looking directly at the wall and had to turn like this to look at the pastors, which may have had advantages that the pastor didn't have to worry about eye contact over there. You know, those things. So you can see in this picture a little bit of the contrast between the Methodist pews in the foreground and the Presbyterian in the back. We were blessed over the years with some banner makers. Bread for the Journey, this one was done entirely by Sarah Baird. By Water and the Spirit, Linda Sharples helped Sarah on this one. And Linda told me when we did this at church here a few weeks ago that Sarah did almost all of it. Linda helped some, but. And then this one, another may reap what is sunshine, summer I've planted. You know, the Brother Van hymn. This one, pretty amazing, the detail that she did. Yeah, Sarah did this one again. We'd give her a theme and she'd come back with it. So, tremendously talented artistic lady. The Flaming Cross on the back of Walner Hall. In the early 90s, somebody said, well, people don't realize Walner Hall has a church connection. And so, how do you do that? Well, you put the church emblem up there, the denominational emblem up there, the Flaming Cross. The ironwork is courtesy of Wes Baird. The red paint is courtesy of Darrell Thackeray's automotive class and became known as the Flame from Hell. Because I guess there's about 20 coats of paint on there before they finally got it to meet what standards Daryl wanted it to have. Because he kept going back and back with it. And so, you know, Daryl would never tell you that, but we heard about that. So, but those are some of the biggest changes that happened outside. Inside, like I said, we did a lot of remodeling. There used to be 3 classrooms in this area here downstairs. This is now where Funshine Preschool meets, is down in the basement in the common area there. Upstairs, the Walner Hall, pretty much the same, other than if you were over there a couple weeks ago. Dennis Downs has painted everything. It's been just repainted. Showing some other artistic folks. Lita Campbell did this glass etching when we were doing the remodeling. And then a few years ago, there were some stained glass windows that we happened upon, and those were installed over there in Walner Hall. Do you know, Amelia, where they came from other than Lita had them?
No, Lita had them and she bought them in an auction sale somewhere.
So these are a couple of them. This shows the rainbow and then the communion. So an Old Testament, New Testament. There are ones showing the nativities and other things. Some of the things that we've done that don't really show up in the 2000, the congregation is probably the biggest things we've seen in recent years is the collaborations. And that's showing a little bit of where we've gone back. If you go back to the 1890s, there was a lot of collaboration. Well, in the early 2000s, we started doing collaboration with the Presbyterians. And by the late 2000s, more than just a few, almost a lot of joint service type things. And then in the 2010s, there's several folks here who are heavily involved with the collaborations with the Lutheran Church, the Assembly of God, the Alliance, and Methodist churches with Loaves and Fishes, the YAV program, JUMP, the youth group, and LEAP, the younger kids group, and then Sunshine Church School. And several of those are still going and gives us the manpower and the number of, that key number of kids and whatever to make things happen. A question was asked one time, has anybody else besides you gone into the ministry out of here? Mrs. West said that these other people had gone into it. I have no idea where C.N. Hurst went, Terrell Newby, or Harold Nelson. They didn't serve in Montana, and it was way back. But Dwight Harshman, the name sounds familiar. It's Morris's older brother. He served throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the early 80s throughout Montana and northern Wyoming. Bob Lynn Sr. served throughout Montana. He took a few years out of ministry and taught down at MSU in Bozeman and did something with the Extension Service, wrote the books, and then came out of retirement for a couple of years at the tail end of his career. Myself, and then Bob Lynn Jr. I got on there just simply because he was baptized and he has home. He was technically a member of this church under the new membership standards and stuff. So, sort of a interesting group of us there. 2 of us were teachers. So if you're, and you're never too old to go into ministry. Brother Van Experience Committee in Great Falls, if you get a chance to go to that building in the summertime when they're doing tours, I do that. Roberta West, some of you may remember Mrs. West. She looked like she was dressed for 1930 all her life. She did a lot of the research that I looked at. Folks here in the Methodist Church that told me stories. And probably Methodists in Montana are known for our singing of this song. And it's harvest time. W.A. Spencer, I mentioned earlier, that preached the first one in Chinook. He's the one that wrote it. And if you went to Marvin Edwards' service, this is the one that we sang at the end. And Morris Harshman's service, this is the one we sang at the end. And I won't sing it. You may have seen these glued or stuck in the back of Methodist hymnals. Any questions?
Can I make a couple of comments?
Sure.
Jack, when they put the handicap railing on
Yes.
the wall, Gene and Dale Clark did that. I mean,
Yes.
Dale, well, they drew it up together and Gene did the welding and Dale helped it.
Yes.
And when they put the air conditioners on top of Walner Hall, Gene, that was quite controversial because a certain person didn't want them down on the ground, so they had to figure out how to put them on top of the hall.
Yeah.
Gene got the brackets for them, and Morris and Andy did all the electrical work for it. And of course, sometimes Morris and Danny weren't getting along, and they had a ladder. Gene would be holding the ladder up on the roof, and Morris would be up here hollering at Danny, and Danny would be down below hollering at Morris. But it got done.
Yes. Yes. In the mid-1990s, there was that ramp, the handicapped accessible ramp was done, and Gene Bunklin, just amazing welder, put that together with Dale Clark helping him, and then the framework for putting the air conditioning up on top of Walner Hall, Gene did as well, and that took a fair amount of engineering in both cases to make that happen because of the weight involved with the air conditioning, and then just figuring out to make it ADA grade, the right grades and stuff, and also have it fit in where the spot was designated. So, yes.
Another thing I'd like to ask is, thanks to Chrissy Downs, we have over 50 kids in jump.
Yeah,
And that's from all the churches and everybody, the John Church affiliated, but that's 50 kids that is very interested in that program.
Yeah, Jump runs upwards of 50 kids.
Yes.
They have done mission trips.
Supper every Wednesday night. She feeds them supper every
Yeah,
Wednesday night.
Wednesday nights they have supper over there, and if you're interested, contact Chrissy and she'll put you to work.
Yeah.
She won't turn it down. Yeah, those are some of the amazing ministries we've had, besides the ones that the church in general has had over the years. I mentioned earlier Intermountain in Helena is amazing. A plug for Intermountain, if you ever want to see you just show up at their office and they'll give you a tour. So they're very interested in that. Any other questions? Yeah, Barb.
Okay, the Bible that you showed, is it a King James?
Yes, it is King James. Yeah, you didn't see too many non-King James around until mid-50s. Yeah, I've had a number of people tell me the only Bible was the King James because that's what God wrote it in. I'm quoting there. So, but yeah. But the King James was written, translated in the 1600s, if I remember correctly, and so it was the same period of time as William Shakespeare was around. So it's Shakespearean English. That's why sometimes it's difficult to understand. Same vocabulary, but it's also why it's very poetic. It has that very poetic ring to it.
Could we buy those pews back?
I bet you can't buy them back for the price you sold them to. Would you like to know what?
I do know, tell them.
$200. Yeah.
You do tours upstairs.
of the upstairs? I don't.
You should do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been up there a couple times, and above the ceiling there in the main sanctuary is probably another 10 feet to 15 feet. The fresh air vents are big enough up there, there's light during the day. But if you go over towards the north, the walkway goes down the same angle as the ceiling, but then there's about an 8-foot drop down to the other ceiling. And it is pitch black over there, even in the brightest day. So, yeah, it's not, but it's big enough you could have an apartment upstairs without any trouble. Really? It's amazingly large.
Well, it's nice to hear your bell Sunday morning. Last summer your bell did ring, right?
Not that I'm aware of.
I'm working on it. but
They're
I
working
haven't-
on it. Now the Zion Lutheran bell still works. Yeah, so
I am working on
some
it.
things wear out after 100+ years. The rope broke after 100 years. I thank you all for being here and putting up with me, and thank you, Sam. Thank you, Ginger, for everything.
Popping that out of there. Thank you so much, Jack. That was a really fascinating, pretty much 140-year history of this very historic church we have in our community. It's really kind of a treasure. I think the provenance that Jack gave, I think really, really proves that it is. So I really enjoyed that. I do want to add, I think I might know who took your photo of the ladies group, and we could maybe cross-reference it with other photos that we have in the museum collection to try to get some of those ladies ID'd. But the time is about right for it to have been taken possibly by Charles Morris, who had a photo studio in the J.F. Williams building across from the Centennial Park. His wife, Helen, I guess, was quite fond of photoshopping things into photos. In the museum collection, we have this old print of theirs, and it's just a pile of potatoes. And I believe she cut a potato out of that photo and put it in one of their postcards. They mass-produced postcards and made it look like it was so large it had to be hauled on a flat rail car. So it looks like Helen's work. So that was the one mystery I was able to solve, possibly. So. All right. Well, Jack, I want to thank you again. And I think Ginger also deserves another round of applause this evening for being our wonderful hostess. This has just been a really wonderful series to put on. Like I said, I'm so grateful to have this partnership. And, you know, I'm looking forward to doing more programs like this in the new year. And I want to thank everybody here, too, for being so supportive and for turning out for these events. But thank you all for coming, and Merry Christmas.